Los Angeles, California, 1994. In the sprawling concrete valley where dreams came to die as often as they were born, a demolition crew was tearing down a monument to forgotten promises. The Sunshine Grove Youth Residence, a sprawling compound in East LA that had been shuttered for 15 years, was finally being erased from the landscape. The plan was simple: clear the lot, sell the land, let luxury condos rise where misery once lived. But as the bulldozers bit into the sun-baked earth behind the main dormitory building, they unearthed something the city had spent a generation trying to forget. Small bones. Dozens of them. Shallow graves with no markers, no names, no acknowledgement that the children buried there had ever existed at all. This is not just the story of what was found in that dirt. It is the story of a former social worker's decades-long guilt, a community organizer's secret files, and a city forced to reckon with the children it had deliberately abandoned. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you this from, and what time is it there? It means everything to know you're here, bearing witness to these forgotten voices with me. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The August heat was murderous that day. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the cracked asphalt. The demolition foreman, a man named Hector Rodriguez, was the one who made the call. He'd been operating heavy machinery for 20 years, and he knew the difference between concrete rubble and something else. When his excavator's bucket scraped against what he first thought was a root system, he stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. He climbed down, his work boots crunching on the debris, and looked into the shallow trench his machine had carved. What he saw made his stomach turn. They were small, too small, unmistakably human. He pulled his cell phone from his belt with shaking hands. Within 2 hours, the site was transformed. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the hot breeze. The LAPD had arrived, along with the county coroner, a politician named Dr. Victor Chen, who had a reputation for smooth efficiency and an even smoother relationship with City Hall. Chen surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a career managing uncomfortable situations. He made his assessment quickly, too quickly. Standing before the assembled construction crew and a single local reporter who had caught wind of the discovery, he spoke with the kind of authority that discouraged questions. "This appears to be a historic burial site," he announced, his voice carrying across the lot. "Possibly from the early 20th century, before proper records were kept. We'll document the remains and work with the appropriate historical societies." The message was clear. This was an unfortunate relic of the past, not a crime scene. Move along. But Hector and his crew knew better. They were locals, men whose families had lived in this neighborhood for generations. They knew the Sunshine Grove Youth Residence had only closed in 1979. They knew the stories their mothers and aunts had whispered about the children who went into that place and never came out. The runaways who were never really runaways at all. As the workers packed up their tools that evening, the whispers began to spread through East LA like wildfire. The news reached Naomi Brooks in the small, meticulously kept apartment in Boyle Heights where she had lived alone for the past decade. She was 48 years old now, her hair touched with gray, her life a quiet routine of volunteering at the local library and tending to her small balcony garden.
But when she saw the evening news broadcast, the aerial footage of the yellow tape, the vague official statements, the carefully neutral language about historic remains, something inside her shattered. The past, which she had worked so hard to bury beneath layers of routine and deliberate forgetfulness, came roaring back with the force of a freight train. She was 23 years old then, fresh out of USC with a master's degree in social work and a heart full of idealistic fire. She had believed, truly believed, that she could make a difference. When she took the job at Sunshine Grove in 1977, she thought she was joining a progressive residential treatment program for at-risk youth. What she found instead was something that haunted her still, something that had stolen her ability to ever work with children again. The facility was a warehouse for the unwanted, a place where the county sent the children nobody else would take. The ones from broken homes, the ones who had been failed by every other system, the ones whose families had given up or disappeared entirely. Most of them were Black and Latino kids from the poorest neighborhoods in LA, sent there for offenses that would have earned white kids from better zip codes a stern lecture and a ride home. Naomi's guilt had a name and a face. His name was Danny Reyes, and he was 11 years old. He had been sent to Sunshine Grove for repeated truancy, but he was sharp as a tack, always asking questions, always pushing back against the facility's brutal rules. The staff saw his intelligence as defiance, his questions as disrespect. She remembered the day he had been accused of stealing food from the kitchen, an extra sandwich he had taken because he was still hungry after the meager dinner portions. He had denied it, his young voice steady and strong. The punishment was 3 days in the quiet room, an isolation cell in the basement. She could still see the 2 orderlies dragging him away, his thin body struggling, his eyes finding hers with a look that asked, "Why won't you help me?" She had stood there, frozen by fear of losing her job, of being blacklisted, of rocking the boat. That night, working late on paperwork, she heard it through the old building's thin floors, Danny's voice crying out from somewhere below. By the second day, the crying had stopped. When she asked about him, the facility director, a cold woman named Lila Freeman, had looked at her with dead eyes and said simply, "He ran away. They always do." Naomi had said nothing. She had accepted the lie, and in doing so, had become part of it. 6 months later, she resigned and never worked in social services again. Now, 23 years later, the news of those graves was not just a headline. It was Danny's voice crying out one final time, and this time, she would not stay silent. Naomi knew she couldn't face this alone. The forces that had buried the truth for so long were still powerful, still woven into the fabric of the city's political machinery. She needed someone who understood the community, who had been documenting the disappeared, who had the moral authority to stand against City Hall. She needed Luis Mendoza. Luis was a community organizer in his early 60s, a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting for East LA's forgotten families. He ran a small nonprofit out of a storefront on Cesar Chavez Avenue, and for decades he had been the person desperate parents turned to when the official systems failed them. When their children vanished into places like Sunshine Grove and were never heard from again. When the police dismissed their concerns. When social services closed their files. They came to Luis. Naomi found him in his cramped office, surrounded by filing cabinets that lined every wall. She told him everything. The memories she had buried, the guilt she had carried, the boy whose cries still echoed in her nightmares. Luis listened with the patient intensity of someone who had heard variations of this story many times before. When she finished, he didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he stood and walked to one of the old metal filing cabinets. The sound of the key turning in the lock was loud in the small room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn manila folder. Inside was a faded photograph of a boy with a gap-toothed smile and bright, intelligent eyes. Beneath it was a handwritten letter from a mother, the ink smudged with what could only be tears, begging for help finding her son who had run away from Sunshine Grove. The boy in the photograph was Danny Reyes. In that moment, Naomi understood that her private nightmare was part of something much larger, a systematic erasure that had been going on for years. Luis had 47 folders in his cabinet, 47 children who had vanished from Sunshine Grove between 1975 and 1979. All officially listed as runaways. "We're going to give them their names back," Luis said quietly. And Naomi knew that this time, finally, she would not stay silent. They worked through the night in Luis's office, cross-referencing Naomi's memories with the files he had kept. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. The children who disappeared were always the ones who fought back, who refused to be broken, who maintained their dignity in a place designed to strip it away. With each name Naomi recognized, with each face that matched a memory, the list grew. The breakthrough came when Naomi remembered something she had taken with her when she left Sunshine Grove. A single carbon copy form she had accidentally packed with her personal belongings. A behavioral incident report documenting Danny's supposed theft and his sentence to the quiet room. At the bottom was a signature she had tried to forget. Lila Freeman, facility director. The same Lila Freeman who is now the director of the County Department of Children and Family Services, a powerful, well-connected bureaucrat whose career had been built on her reputation as a reformer. But they needed more than memories and a single form. They needed physical proof, something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Naomi remembered something about the building's layout, something that had never made sense. In the basement, where the quiet rooms were located, there was a section of wall that looked different, newer concrete, clumsily patched over what appeared to be a doorway. She had asked about it once, and a janitor had told her it was sealed after a pipe burst. But the explanation had never sat right with her. She shared this with Luis, and together they contacted the one person in the city who might take them seriously. A young investigative reporter named Sarah Chen from the LA Times, who had been writing about systemic failures in the county's child welfare system. Sarah met them at a coffee shop in Monterey Park, skeptical but intrigued. When they showed her the documentation, the form with Freeman's signature, the photographs from Luis's files, Naomi's detailed testimony, her skepticism began to crack. When Naomi told her about the sealed wall in the basement, Sarah made a decision. She would push her editors to investigate. Getting access to the sealed demolition site required Sarah to call in every favor she had. The LAPD was resistant, the coroner's office dismissive, but the pressure from her newspaper's legal team and the growing public interest forced them to allow a limited inspection. Sarah brought along a structural engineer and convinced Naomi to guide them. Descending into that basement was like walking into Naomi's nightmares made real. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old decay. She led them to the back wall, and there it was, just as she remembered, the section of newer concrete that stood out like a scar. The engineer examined it and confirmed it was not original to the building. With Sarah documenting everything on camera, they began to carefully break through. What they found behind that wall stole the breath from everyone present. It was a hidden corridor leading to a series of small, windowless cells, smaller than a prison cell, barely large enough for a child to lie down. Bolted to the walls were restraints, rusted but unmistakable. In one corner, they found a metal box. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic, were intake records, dozens of them, documenting children who had been placed in intensive behavioral modification, but who had no corresponding release paperwork. Children who had simply disappeared from the official record. Among those records was Danny Reyes's file. Cause of transfer to intensive modification, persistent defiance and food theft. There was no release date, no notation that he had run away, just a handwritten note in the margin. Expired during treatment. Notify LF for disposal. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed every page. This was no longer a story about historic graves. This was evidence of systematic abuse, negligence, and murder, covered up for nearly 2 decades. The LA Times published Sarah's investigation on a Sunday morning, and the city erupted. The headline was stark and damning. The Children of Sunshine Grove, hidden records revealed decades of abuse, death, and cover-up by county officials. The centerpiece of the article was the photograph of Danny's file, with that chilling handwritten notation, and a current photograph of Lila Freeman at a county award ceremony, smiling and accepting recognition for her service to children. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests organized by Luis's network of community organizations filled the streets outside City Hall and the County Department of Children and Family Services. The national media descended on Los Angeles, their cameras capturing the anger of families who had never stopped looking for their children, who had been told for years that their kids were runaways, troublemakers, lost causes. Lila Freeman, the woman who had built a career on her image as a child welfare advocate, went into full crisis management mode. She held a press conference, her voice steady and measured, expressing shock and sadness at the revelations. She claimed she had been a young, powerless staffer at Sunshine Grove, that she had reported concerns to her superiors who had ignored her, that she had left the facility because she couldn't stomach what was happening there. She positioned herself as a whistleblower, not a perpetrator. But Naomi and Luis had anticipated this. They had one more piece of evidence they had been holding back, waiting for this exact moment. Through Luis's network, they had found him, a former janitor from Sunshine Grove, a man named Robert Martinez, who was now in his 70s, living in a nursing home in Riverside. Robert had carried the weight of what he had witnessed for 23 years, and the news of the graves had finally broken his silence. With his permission, Sarah published his testimony. In a recorded interview, his voice shaking but clear, Robert described being ordered by Director Freeman personally to dispose of bodies in the dead of night, to dig graves in the back lot, to keep his mouth shut or lose his job and potentially face criminal charges as an accomplice. He described Freeman not as a powerless young staffer, but as the architect of the cover-up, the one who signed off on the extreme punishment protocols, the one who personally destroyed records. The city's narrative collapsed. The County Board of Supervisors, facing a firestorm of public outrage and the threat of federal intervention, suspended Freeman pending investigation. A special prosecutor was appointed. The FBI opened the civil rights investigation.
18 months later, on a cool March morning, a new kind of gathering took place where Sunshine Grove had once stood. The old buildings were gone, erased from the earth. In their place was a memorial park, designed in consultation with the families of the lost children and the community that had never forgotten them. At the center of the park stood a curved wall of black granite, polished to a mirror shine. Etched into the stone were 47 names. Every child Luis had documented in his files, every young life that had been taken and then erased. Among them, in letters that caught the morning light, was Danny Reyes, 1966 to 1977. Naomi stood before the wall, her hand nesting on Danny's name, surrounded by families who had waited decades for this acknowledgement. Luis stood beside her, his own eyes wet with tears. Sarah Chen was there too, notebook in hand, documenting this final chapter. The investigation had resulted in criminal charges. Lila Freeman was facing trial for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Other former staff members had been indicted. The county had established a truth and reconciliation process and had begun the painful work of reforming its child welfare system. "You gave them their voices back," Luis said quietly to Naomi. Naomi looked at the names carved in stone, at the families holding photographs of children who would never grow old, at the community that had refused to let their stories be buried. She thought about Danny's face that last time she had seen him, the question in his eyes. "Not in time to save them," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of all those lost years. "But finally, they're not forgotten anymore." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the memorial. The names that had been deliberately erased by a system of indifference were now set in stone, permanent and undeniable. The children of Sunshine Grove had been silenced in life, but in death, their voices would echo forever.